Welcome to Morbid Whispers, where we explore the most chilling and twisted tales of true crime. Today, we journey into the dark and disturbing world of Peter Kurten, the infamous Vampire of Düsseldorf. A man whose sadistic crimes terrorized an entire city, Kurten's story is one of unimaginable cruelty and bloodlust. How did this seemingly ordinary man become one of history's most notorious serial killers? Join us as we delve into the life, crimes, and psychological horrors of Peter Kurten, a case that still haunts Germany to this day. Kurten was born the eldest of 13 children in Cologne on May 26, 1883, and his childhood was one of unremitting poverty and violence. The Kurten family rented a one-bedroom apartment and lived in fear of Peter's father, a molder by trade, a habitual drunkard. He would return home from the local inn, beat his children. Peter, as the eldest, felt the brunt of the violence and rape his wife in front of them. In later years, he also sexually assaulted his daughters. 19th century Germany was no place for a battered wife, and Peter's mother was forced to endure her violent marriage in silence. Subjected to this daily routine of violence, Peter became twisted and formed an unhealthy friendship with a dog catcher who lived in the same building. At the age of 9, Peter pushed a friend off a raft as they played on the River Rhine. When another boy jumped in to try and help the drowning youngster, Peter held him under the water until he suffocated. The death of the two boys was attributed to an accident, and Peter was cleared of any blame. Kurten ran away from home at the age of 16, and shortly afterwards his father was jailed for 3 years after being convicted of incest with Peter's 13-year-old sister. Young Peter lived by his wits and often stole food and clothing to survive. He would be in and out of jail for the next 24 years and claimed his brutal treatment in the penal system made him hell-bent on wreaking revenge on society. A charming, handsome, and, when money allowed it, dapper young man, Kurten did not have trouble attracting women, but his violent lust and complete lack of empathy or normal human emotions meant that he was incapable of falling in love. In May 1913, not long after being released from prison again, he was prowling the streets of Cologne looking for somewhere to rob. Above an inn in Wolfstrasse, he found a young girl asleep in her bed. When the body of 10-year-old Christine Klein was found the next morning, suspicion fell on her uncle, Otto, who had argued with the girl's father the night before and threatened to do something he would remember all his life. Otto was charged with murder but fortunately acquitted by a jury, which decided there was insufficient evidence. The identity of Christine's killer would not become clear for another 18 years. In 1914, with war clouds growing over Europe, Kurten was called up into the Kaiser's army. But military life did not suit the self-centered and ill-disciplined Kurten, and he soon deserted. He was caught and sent to jail and would remain there throughout the war and its aftermath. Kurten spent much of his time in solitary confinement. He would often deliberately infringe rules, so he would be locked up alone and would spend his time amid violent fantasies. He would imagine attacking people, setting fires, and even sabotaging railways in order to kill as many people as possible. On his release in 1921, he went to stay with his sister in the small town of Altenburg. There he met his future wife, a former prostitute who herself had spent 4 years in jail for shooting a man who had jilted her at the altar. She was eaten up by guilt and spent the rest of her life convinced that she must accept her fate to gain redemption for her sins. Eventually they wed and lived in Altenburg until 1925, with Kurten gaining employment in a factory as a molder. He also became an active trade unionist. The couple moved to Düsseldorf to find work, and Kurten gradually found his self-control eroding. Between 1925 and 1928, he attacked 4 women in Düsseldorf, strangling them to the point of unconsciousness, often during sex. He also took up arson and would derive sexual satisfaction from imagining that a tramp was burning alive in a barn he had just torched. Then, on the night of February 9, 1929, he waylaid an 8-year-old girl, Rosa Olliger, as she walked down a Düsseldorf street. She was stabbed 3 times and found under a hedge. Kurten, who had tried to set fire to the body with petrol, later recalled having had an orgasm at the height of the attack. The murder of Rosa Oliger was only the start of a stream of attacks on women, girls, and occasionally men in and around Düsseldorf. Some, such as Maria Kuhn, survived. She was stabbed 24 times. The reign of terror lasted throughout 1929 and into 1930, and the panic and outrage grew in the Düsseldorf area as each crime was luridly recounted in the German newspapers, with references to monsters and vampires. One of the most horrendous crimes occurred on August 23, 1929, as people in the town of Flee were celebrating an annual fair. Kurten approached two foster sisters as they left the fair and asked the older one, Louise Linzen, 14, to run an errand for him. "Would you be very kind and get some cigarettes for me? I'll look after the little girl," he said. Louise agreed, but as soon as she was out of sight, he strangled 5-year-old Gertrude Hamaker and slit her throat. When Louise returned, she too was dragged off the path, strangled and almost decapitated with Kurten's pocket knife. The attacks, many of them fatal, continued throughout the summer and autumn of 1929. On November 7th, after killing 5-year-old Gertrude Alberman, Kurten sent a map to a local newspaper showing where her body could be found under a pile of builders' debris. She had been strangled and stabbed 35 times. German police had few clues to go on. Those who had survived the attacks were only able to give a basic description of a tall white man, which could have fitted half the residents of Düsseldorf. Kurten continued his onslaught throughout the winter and spring of 1930, but fortunately he did not claim any more lives. Then, on May 14, 1930, an unemployed domestic servant called Maria Budlik arrived in Düsseldorf from Cologne looking for work. The Great Depression had hit Germany particularly hard and millions were jobless. She met a man who offered to show her the way to a boarding house where she could stay the night. But when he tried to show her a shortcut through a park, she became worried and, remembering the newspaper stories about the Vampire of Düsseldorf, began arguing and making her excuses. Suddenly, a second man intervened on her behalf and rescued her from the first man. Maria told the man she was out of work and had nowhere to go, and he offered to put her up in his apartment in Mettmanner Strasse. He did not introduce himself, but his name was Peter Kurten. He took her back to his apartment. His wife was away for the night and tried to have sex with her, but she demurred, and he agreed to find her somewhere else to stay. They got on a tram, and he then led her into the Grafenberger woods. Kurten grabbed her by the neck and raped her before leading her back to the tram and letting her go free. Asked later why he had not killed her, he said, "I had no intention of killing her as she offered no resistance. I also did not think that Budlik would be able to find her way back to my apartment in the rather obscure Mettmanner Strasse." But Maria remembered the street name and Kurten's apartment vividly. Deeply traumatized and ashamed of the stigma of being a rape victim, she did not go to the police but wrote a letter to a friend telling her of the experience. By chance, the letter was misdirected and was opened by a woman who immediately took it to the police. Detectives traced Maria Budlik and persuaded her to give a full account of the incident. Eventually, she led officers back to 71 Mettmanner Strasse and saw Kurten on the stairs. She was too terrified to point him out, even in the presence of so many police officers, and by the time she did open her mouth, he had packed a bag and fled. Kurten moved into an apartment nearby and told his wife what happened with Maria Budlik. He told her he would be sent to jail for many years and she, without his earnings, would be destitute. Kurten recalled later, "She raved that I should take my life, then she would do the same, since her future was completely without hope." But he came up with a plan. He confessed to her that he was the Vampire of Düsseldorf and said she should take advantage to obtain the large reward being offered for information leading to his capture. She eventually agreed. Kurten had planned to carry out one more spectacular attack before his capture, but his wife went immediately to the police, and when he met her again, as arranged outside the St. Rochus Church on May 24th, police armed with revolvers surrounded him. Kurten freely confessed to his crimes and indeed relished going into great detail and seeing police officers and stenographers wincing and grimacing at his horrors. He had relived his crimes many times over in his mind and had an almost photographic memory, He could recall tiny details of Christine Klein's bedroom from 17 years before. Kurten went on trial in April 1931, and he initially withdrew his confession and pleaded not guilty. But he later changed his mind, under questioning by the examining magistrate, and was eventually convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to death. As Kurten was awaiting execution, he was interviewed by Dr. Carl Berg, whose interviews and accompanying analysis of Kurten formed the basis of his book, The Sadist. Kurten stated to Berg that his primary motive was one of sexual pleasure. The number of stab wounds varied because it sometimes took longer to achieve orgasm. The sight of blood was integral to his sexual stimulation. On the night before his execution, he ate a last meal of Wiener Schnitzel, fried potatoes, and white wine and asked the prison psychiatrist, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck?" When the doctor replied that his ears and brain probably would function for several seconds after the blade struck, Kurten replied, "That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Kurten was executed on July 2, 1931 by guillotine in Cologne. In 1931, scientists attempted to examine irregularities in Kurten's brain in an attempt to explain his personality and behavior. His head was dissected and mummified, and is currently on display at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin Dells. Kurten thought a lot about himself and reached a fair degree of self-recognition. He was aware of his fatal sadistic propensity, but always explained this due to heredity and his upbringing. There were a number of occasions, however, when Kurten seems to have recognized his evil nature and made it clear to a victim, in doing so almost apologizing for his unnecessary actions. This is highly unusual for lust killers of Peter's type, who are normally entirely convinced by their motives for atonement. Also interestingly, when considering all the psychopathic tendencies exhibited by Kurten, is that his inclination to lie and deceive was supremely cultivated, and the mask of a respectable citizen was scarcely penetrable. His calm assurance allowed him to time his attacks perfectly and then to move off swiftly into the night. Yet the most puzzling characteristic of Kurten is the immense loyalty shown to his wife. For this killer, the infidelity of the assaults weighed more heavily than the bloody murder. A baffling character, Frau Kurten exhibited great humility throughout her married life and saw the bad times with Peter as punishment for her sinful former existence. As much as Kurten himself disrespected women, he seems to have understood this devotion and once commented, "My relations with my wife were always good. I did not love her in the sensual way, but because of my admiration for her fine character." Was it perhaps that Kurten loved his wife for her preoccupation with the concept of redemption, an emotion that he seems incapable of displaying? Maybe if others had provided him with more than crude sexual gratification, a selfless and self-effacing love, Peter Kurten would not have turned out quite the way he did. It is, however, all pure conjecture. There will always remain the problem of the genesis of Kurten's sadistic perversions, and we, as analysts of true crime, will never know the full truth. One may advance a number of heredity and emotional factors, and yet still be without a convincing explanation to the psychological riddle he presents. Godwin once stated that love is the gateway of life, as hate is the way of death, and it was Kurten's tragedy that he died without discovering this eternal truth. Whatever the answer may be to the great enigma that was Peter Kurten, perhaps it is fitting to leave the final words of this analysis to the killer himself. As I now see the crimes committed by me, they are so ghastly that I do not want to attempt any sort of excuse for them. I am prepared to bear the consequences of my misdeeds and hope that thus I will atone for a large part of what I have done. And when you consider my execution and recognize my goodwill to atone for all my crimes, I should think that the terrible desire for revenge and hatred against me cannot endure. And I want to ask you to forgive me. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling exploration of Peter Kurten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. His reign of terror is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human soul. If you found this case as disturbing as we did, make sure to subscribe to Morbid Whispers for more deep dives into the world's most notorious and chilling crimes. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so don't forget to like, comment, and share your insights below. Until next time, stay cautious, stay curious, and remember, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that walk among us.